City University Television presents the American Theater Wing Seminars. Working in the theater. This seminar, Design.
A warm welcome to the American Theater Wing's Working in the Theater Seminars, now in the 31st year, coming to you from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. These seminars offer a rare opportunity to explore with the panelists the realities of working in the theater. This panel discussion is with stage designers. We learn about how and why these scenic, costume, lighting, and sound designers became professionals, and just how significant and important their contributions are to the success of any theatrical production. I'm Isabel Stevenson, Chairman of the Board of the American Theater Wing. Now, let me introduce our moderator for the seminar, the distinguished critic, professor, and editor of the Best Plays book series, and a member of the Wing's Advisory Committee, Jeffrey Eric Jenkins. Jeffrey.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you. In the beginning of Tennessee Williams' The Glass Menagerie, he talks about illusion and truth, the appearance of illusion and the actual truth. With us today, we have a group of stage magicians. Although they don't pull rabbits out of their hats, maybe sometimes they feel like they pull rabbits out of their hats, what they show us is truth wrapped in the pleasant disguise of illusion and the illusions of truth. I want to introduce them to you today. To my far right is Suzy Benzinger, costume designer. Next is Rui Rita, lighting designer. Next is David Meschter, sound designer and composer. To my immediate left is Beverly Emmons, lighting designer. To her immediate left is David Rockwell, who's a scenic designer and an architect. And to his immediate left is Adrianne Lobel, who is a scenic designer and now a producer. So first we'll start with Suzy Benzinger. Now, Suzy, you've gotten the job. You've been hired as the designer, as the costume designer. What's the first thing that you do? How do you approach the job?
Well, for me, I think every designer works differently, but for me, after I read the script and have a very sort of brief chat with the director, because I like to know what they're thinking, I read the script again, and I actually work in color first. I mean, I think a lot of different designers work in form or things, but I read the script and I think color. It's the first thing that comes to me naturally, is to think color, and then I go from there. I mean, that's generally my first feeling, is I go through color, and then I go through color with the director. And do they see it in their mind like that? And sometimes, some directors, it sort of takes them back a bit, because that's not how they're thinking. They're thinking character or something. But I generally think color, and then once I get that plot down, then everything else very easily sort of moves from there. From the color, for me, is really the foundation of design.
Adrianne Lobel, how does that work for you in scenic design? Are you interacting with the director? How do you interact with producers as well, by the way? And do you tell yourself what to do?
Two different subjects.
Do you tell yourself what to do?
That's the question. Spend the next hour talking. It is a response. You read the script, you listen to the music. I don't think in color. I think that comes later. I tend to do very rough sketches for a period of time and overlays. So it's almost like being in a fog. And then as you draw, the fog clears, and I get ideas from drawing. It's very rare that I just have an intellectual concept immediately. It can happen. I mean, every project is different, and sometimes that dream thing happens where you wake up in the morning and you say, aha, I know what it's going to be. But usually, even if it's just giving myself time to think, it is a process of layering through the murk. And it's in very rough, as you draw more finely, the ideas become clearer. It really is that connected. In doing that, it gives a director an in at different phases of my thinking. I can allow a director to see fairly rough sketches and have some impulse, some input at that point. That's how it works for me.
Beverly Emmons, you're a lighting designer with more than 30 credits on Broadway. How does that process work for you in the design process? How does that process unfold? The visualization of it, I mean, in your own head, in your mind, thinking about it.
Lighting designers, there's an idea, especially in the academic world of theater, that at the beginning all the designers and the directors arrive in a room and commune, and that doesn't happen. Lighting designers are usually hired after the director and the scenic designer have already started to flesh out the universe of the piece. And I read a script very quickly just to say, oh yeah, it's okay, it's one of those, it's got this, it's blah, 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 just so that I know, okay, what we're dealing with. Because I don't want to imagine it. I want to find my way into their imaginings because they're already way ahead of me. And that the life of the play is already in part determined by their explorations and work. And at that point, it triggers off either a very clear kind of image that I couldn't begin to put into words, but I sort of see something. And then there's the back and forth between, well, how might I make that, given the context of time, money, equipment, real estate, because if the scenic designer has filled the air with scenery, oh well, that's very nice, but there's no room for my stuff. Yeah. In which case, some of those limitations, in fact, set the style. They're not limitations that are bad, necessarily. They're just part of the structure, and to say, well, okay, I mean, that sets the tone of it. So it's that back and forth. I like your word fog, because I find the moment of sitting down at a drafting table, big bare piece of paper. Sometimes there's a scenic drawing underneath it, but there's a big paper, and you can calm yourself by saying, well, I know one thing. Right. I know where the center line is.
Specifics are
so I put that down in the middle of the
important.
paper, right? And then I know the next thing. Once I have the center line, I know the next thing, and that's where the proscenium is inevitably going to sit. So you work from what's known to what's unknown, slowly working out and fleshing out the details.
Yeah. Having some specifics at the beginning, so it isn't all just a big mush, is very helpful, like the size of the proscenium. Yeah. I think a very important aspect of designing anything, and it comes with this sketching process for me, is deciding what the scale of the human being is in the volume of space. So if you start with the proscenium opening, if you just keep drawing that box over and over and over again, then whatever decision you make, even if it's rough, starts to be a decision you can pull information from.
So are you working in your mind in front elevation in a way at the beginning?
Yeah, at the beginning.
Yeah.
Not always, but that's the general approach. How do you do it?
Well, fog's a good word. What really compels me to be involved in theater is the storytelling nature of it, and the scenic designer's ability to connect emotionally with a story. And in fact, as an architect, one would assume that sort of our interest in theater would be in static stage pictures, but it's exactly the opposite. It's the fact that theater is this sort of unbelievably powerful communal celebration where everyone comes together and you're telling these stories in real time and things can transition. So what we do is I tend to immerse myself in the project, the period of the project, the storytelling. And I remember on Hairspray with Jack O'Brien, I had a room this big filled with enough sketches for the ring cycle. I mean, there's an extraordinary amount of ideas, and we looked at it and talked about it, and he kind of looked at everything, and Jerry Mitchell was there, and he put his arm around me, and he said, now let's talk about the 4 things that will make you fall in love with the protagonist the most. And let's talk about storytelling and the way the scenic design extends that. So I guess what I look for is a unique point of view in a way that the physical environment creates delight, surprise, and moves. It's kind of the movement that is, I find, the hardest first thing to work out.
Rui Rita, you have an ongoing relationship with some directors, and you have an ongoing relationship with the Williamstown Theater Festival, I believe. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
How does that work for you as a designer? How does that allow you to develop your own sort of visual vocabulary, a way of a palette, a creative palette?
It helps me tremendously as a designer. It helps me even more as a person, I think, because we find ourselves going from show to show, having quick relationships with people, working very intimately with fellow designers and collaborating, and then you move on to your next project. And there's always that sense of coming together for a very intense emotional period, and then that goodbye, which many of us, myself included, tend to make that as quick as possible and out the door. So it helps me more as a person having those relationships, because I know that I'll see these people again. I know that I'll have a sense of that there's a comfort level there. For instance, on Enchanted April, we've all done many shows together, all of the design team and the director. So when there were issues, as there always are in producing any production, particularly commercial theater, but there's a sort of a automatic sense of comfort, and there's no looking over your back, or there's just a very sort of pleasing.
When you say issues, what do you mean issue? Do you mean design, particular creative issues, or do you mean the personality issues that arise when creators get into a room together? Or?
Yes, all of the above.
All of the above.
Pretty much all of that. I mean, as with anything that we create, there are everyone has opinions, and it is a collaboration. That's what we bring to the table, and everyone has an agenda. And getting everybody onto the same agenda is part of the joy of the fog, which I love the fog. I know that fog is this seminar could be nicknamed the fog because
the resonant image.
Particularly since I do some of my best thinking in the shower in the morning.
Yes, me too.
And it's so clear when I'm first approaching the show.
Yeah.
And I think about the style first. And that sort of, when you don't need something really in front of you, when it's all up here.
It's a decision-making process, and I think students are very afraid of that. They think they have to know it all to begin with, right. And they go from A to Z, and it becomes very frustrating. And you just have to, a design process is about learning how you get from A to Z.
Right. You can't actually really take any risks, any designers, without trust among the team. That's what's interesting about what you said, that so the lighting designer may be brought in after some decisions are made. Well, if you're not sitting down talking about how it's all going to work together, then it's very hard to take any risks, it seems to me, and do anything interesting without a real level of trust between
You
everyone.
have to really feel that you can be stupid with these people.
Right.
Well,
Everyone
it's
should be
also-
able to say what they want.
It's also what we do collectively is a nonverbal process. Words give you clues, but visual images give you clues. And I think, again, the academic world is has such a literary and verbal base to it. And what we do is not verbal. And I know that one of the things about working with a director, again, is now we both know what we mean by those words, because those words will be a vocabulary that will develop between the two of you, or the four of you, or whatever the team is. And it's that aspect. I had a director at a production meeting show me the picture of a sand dune, Ripples sand dune, and we were doing a 12th night, and he said, this is it. This is what I want to communicate to you. I thought, what is he talking about? It's a sand dune. Well, but I don't say right away, I don't understand you. Oh my God, no, I would nod wisely, of course. Wonderful image, beautiful, got it. And then wait for a while. Just wait and listen. And sure enough, talking to the scenic designer, I heard him aside talking about all the stuff he wanted on the floor. And I said, oh, he wants to see the ripples in this sand dune. He likes the idea of floor texture. And there was no way he could say that to me. And that's not he shouldn't feel he has to.
Sure.
In many cases, the words come afterwards to post-rationalize what
But I think it is important to, I mean, I think most, in my acquaintance, designers are extremely articulate. And I think that we are visual artists, but I think it's very important to be able to put your ideas into words and your concepts into words. It's also a help in decision-making process.
Well, let's shift. I want to shift for just a moment because we're talking a lot about visual images. We're talking about costumes and color and light and scenic ideas. We have a sound designer with us, which we don't often have. Who's a sound designer and a composer, David Meschter, who has a broad spectrum of work. Most recently on Broadway with the sound design, and did you do composition for Medea as well?
No, the composition of the sound score was by Mel Mercier.
Okay, but
I
you were
did
the sound
designer for the piece.
And you know, this is a different kind of element. This plays into the visual imagery. It supports the text. But could you tell us a little bit about how you feel the sound designer weaves into that whole process?
Well, it's actually different for every production because sound design means different things to different people. For some people, sound design, if they're bringing a sound designer into a project, they would want that person to handle all of the aspects of the sound, any sound effects, any composed music or other kinds of music that would be brought into it. Others see a sound designer as someone who is going to help the actors to be heard and maybe not much more. In the situation with Medea, that piece came to me with the sound score already intact, and the composer had very specific ideas of how he wanted the sound design to, or how he wanted his sound score to appear and move in the piece. So he and I sat down with that and discussed the architecture. Also, this piece had to tour, so we had to discuss not only what would work in the at the Harvey Theater at BAM, where we were first working, but it also had to be able to be done on tour in spaces where they were using all rented equipment. So he and I sat down for a while, and also with Deborah Warner, the director, and kind of mapped out the sounds. She was familiar with his sound score. I was not so familiar with it yet. So we sat down and discussed the different types of sounds, how they're going to be used, and Mel helped me understand how he was using those sounds to support what was happening on stage. And then I helped flesh it out as far as what equipment was going to be necessary and where things could be hung and what we could do at the Majestic but couldn't do at the Wilbur in Boston and things like that.
Sure. Well then, how does it work? You've also worked with Ping Chong, Meredith Monk, right?
Yes.
Merce Cunningham,
Yep.
is that right?
Yeah.
Several years with Merce Cunningham.
Yes. Yeah.
So you've been an integral part of a team, and this sort of goes back to that thing we were talking about a moment ago, that we often think of as the artistic home. You know, the artistic group that we work with. How has that worked for you, and how do you sort of develop a sound design for that kind of work? That's a different sort of thing than theater, but I think it plays into the...
Yeah, well, I have to say it's different for every project. For instance, I started off with the Merce Cunningham Dance Company, and in many ways that spoiled me for my entire career. Because when I first started working with them, I had imagined that artists to have been doing the kind of extreme work they had done all their lives, they would have to be these incredibly egotistical, maniacal people that would say that, well, if you don't understand what we're doing, well, that's your problem. But nothing could have been further from the truth. They just do what they do, and if you like it, that's marvelous, and if not, well, we're going to do it tomorrow someplace else anyway. And that was really my first work in professional sound and theater, and I had total free rein to do anything. Basically, the musicians did not want to fight the spaces they were performing in. They wanted to use them, and my job was to put as many channels of sound around the theater as I could. And even for them, the quality of the sound of the speakers was not important, because if one sounded pretty bad, that might be interesting to them. Particularly David Tudor, who used to want to know, he used to want me to hook up the speakers that hadn't been used in 7 to 10 years. But then, say, working with Ping Chong, it's quite different. Ping also is very good about inviting the designers for a lot of input, but he has some very specific ideas about his piece when he brings it into the theater. and is open to other ideas. But he has a very clear map as to the kinds of things he wants. And as I try to fulfill them, sometimes I think what he's asking for either I'm not connecting with or I don't think it's right. I'll discuss it with him, and he can be very open to things. Other times he'll say, well, that's a good idea, but I want it my cue there. I go, okay, fine.
Suzy, I'm looking at your credits on Broadway and your recent credits on Broadway. You're the costume designer for the costume designer for Movin Out, and you did Saturday Night Fever, and there was one other that slips out of my mind right this moment. That
Saigon.
Miss Saigon, right? It's almost as if you provide the color and imagery for an entire generation, a kind of a baby boom generation of costume design. How does that? How does
I don't know how that ever happened.
Never thought about that.
I didn't mean to. No,
It just
absolutely not.
when I was looking at your credits, it just occurred to me that there's this sort of through line because Movin Out's very much about the 1960s and 70s played through Billy Joel's music. And Miss Saigon, of course, we know, that's
right.
all about Vietnam. And then Saturday Night Fever was a major, important cultural influence in the 1970s. What I'm interested in, though, are the nuts and bolts as well. How do costumes, what do you have to do when you're designing the costumes, when you're dealing with Saturday Night Fever in order to get that imagery across? And then what has to be different in Movin Out, which is just the movement is everywhere, and the bodies have to be able to move with the costumes. The costumes have to move with the bodies. How does that work, in putting that design together?
Well, luckily, over the years, I had worked with Theone Aldridge for like 8 years, so I, had done a lot of musicals with dance, and I guess that's sort of the through line, probably, in all those shows, is that the dance was really important, and the movement, and I think with all those shows, basically, the dancers have to feel as though they're in character, that they are characters, but they have to be able to dance. But I didn't want the clothes to look like dance clothes. I didn't want that whole feeling, either with it. And they had to tell a story. I mean, the funny thing was someone said to me the other day about working with Twyla, because I was really not very familiar with, I had seen some of her dance concerts, but I wasn't really all that familiar with her style. And they said what it was like to work with her and what the first meetings were discussing dance. And I said, we never discussed dance. Ever. Never talked about dance once. I mean, we talked about the characters and the story, but never once discussed actually what they were doing in the clothes. But after seeing some of her pieces in the past, I knew that everything had to be danceable, that there was no question that everything had to be. So probably the through line with all those shows is that everything had to be. Nick Heitner worked as very closely with Bobby Avian and making sure that everything in Saigon was about movement and space, and I think all the shows probably have that kind of through line, actually. So I guess my start really is making the dancers feel like they're not in dance costumes, that they can do anything they want, without feeling constricted. But yet they still have to tell a story, because you're sitting in the audience. You want to know what the story's about.
Adrianne, you're the current designer for and producer of A Year with Frog and Toad. And as I look at some of your credits, I see a variety of styles that you have used. I mean, there's this sort of the whimsical quality of A Year with Frog and Toad. And it was interesting that you mentioned how human beings fit into the picture. It's a very human perspective in that the human dimension to A Year with Frog and Toad. But then when we look at, say, Passion, and I guess you collaborated with Beverly Emmons on that, how does Passion, how do you sort of shift style like that? There's a very different kind of look about that. Often we find that artists have a kind of, and I used the word earlier, a visual vocabulary. I love the term. And do you feel that you have that, or do you feel
style's a dangerous word, and I don't think any of us would want to feel that we have a style. I think we would all like to feel that we respond to a text or a piece of music in a completely fresh but personal way. I think if you wanted to give my work a definition, it would be that I'm a minimalist, that I don't believe that anything should be on stage that isn't helping to tell the story, even in an abstract way. It's to go back to the subject of collaborating with people that you trust. It's very important because it does segue into the producing aspect of Frog and Toad. When you have worked with the same group of people many, many times, there is this unspoken understanding. For example, I have done so much work with Jim Ingalls, the lighting designer, and when I know that he's designing a piece, it gives me a great leeway to be as minimal as I really want to be. It means I can have one drop that is painted as a translucency with some opacity maybe on the back with translucent dyes, and that he will get 45 looks out of it. And then I don't need 16 drops. I just need that one. And what was wonderful about producing is that I was able to call upon these people that I've worked with so many times. It was really a no-brainer. I mean, I think that that's a big difference between regular producers who say, well, who had the last big hit? Let's hire that person. To really putting together a group of people to make a show together, people whose vision you understand and who you want to work with. It was very satisfying on that level. But I would say, in answer to your question, every show is different, and I think there's a danger in sort of sticking to a style. I mean, I did Diary of Anne Frank too, which is total realism. I've done some super real, did Street Scene in Houston, movie realism, and then Passion's completely abstract. And the dance work I've done for Mark Morris has been either cartoony or abstract. Or I think that what's important is telling the story, is movement in space, is volume, is allowing room for the lighting designer to do their work.
What was interesting about Frog and Toad, I thought visually, was how it seemed inspired by the drawings, but wasn't slavishly reproducing them.
Right.
And in doing that, it captured some of the spirit, and it kind of clarified what the spirit of the pieces were.
Well, that was a scary and wonderful process for me, because yes, I agree with you. I made a very conscious decision in Frog and Toad not to. I've seen illustrators do set design, and it's never very satisfying for me. It's like you take the drawing and you stick it on stage, and it ends up looking goofy because the line becomes very large and the shape becomes grotesque. So I pulled back from doing that. The illustrations became much more clean and architectural. And it was about scale. You know, here's a person and there's a flower this big, so they're instantly tiny. But it also was about how do you cut up the space with these flat things. You know, Toad's house has a roof and then a plane behind it. So it isn't just a flat plane. There's some space for some volume and some light to happen. Same thing with all the drops. I really used very kind of 19th century old theater technique.
Jeffrey, when you have the show, you got the show, when do you all come together? At what point do you all come together in the show?
At what point?
As the process begins, when do you begin to meet as a group? When do you...
First
Sometimes
preview,
text.
usually.
That's always hard because everyone's really busy.
Well, that's a question. That's a question
Yeah.
that is of interest to me when we start thinking about this element of collaboration and how the collaboration process works. You know, everybody gets together and sort of you say, okay, we just get together in tech.
Nobody ever gets together.
Beverly
Right,
Emmons.
right. Like Beverly Emmons is a lighting designer. She sort of has to do her palette, her color palette in front of a room full of people. Start mixing it at the same time. And, you know, do you have a little theater where you get to play those games?
No,
We wish.
no, lighting designers do their work in the eye of the hurricane. But
There's a couple of meetings where you look
there
at
are
the
a couple
plan
of
and
meetings.
section.
Sometimes
Look at the model.
Sometimes there's a first meeting. At least we see each other the first day of rehearsal. But the economics of the thing. I mean, obviously, in order to rehearse the play, the director and the scenic designer have to know what they're doing because they got to put the tape on the floor, right? And the director has to know where the table and chair is because they're going to stuff like. What I would like to know isn't known yet, isn't knowable yet, because I want that moment when the two characters are sitting. One is sitting and one is standing, and this is the most important moment of the play, and I want to make sure that both sides of their faces are lit so that the intensity is going between them. But I don't know where they're going to sit, and neither does the director. So the process of the rehearsal, of finding the life of the play in the actors and the cast, it hasn't happened yet, and the light plot has to be finished before the first day of rehearsal. So I'm imagining things that are unknowable yet, and therefore part of the professionalism is to put enough stuff up there, enough possibilities, a whole palette. I call it a palette like a painter has a palette of a bunch of colors. He doesn't know, he's going to mix them, right? So he squeezes a little this, a little that, a little that. That's what a light plot is for me. It's a bunch of possibilities that you then use as you paint through moment by moment.
Lighting designers are really on the hot seat. It's like
Yeah.
someone's watching you do the rough sketches.
Yeah.
I would never want that many people watching me do the rough sketches.
It seems like as technology gets bigger and bigger, too, the plot due date keeps getting earlier and earlier, so we have to make these decisions earlier and earlier.
Right.
You know, it's no longer really possible to wait
I would
until the
suspect
last minute.
sound is more like what we do, because again, there's no words when the director says, I want a dog barking outside the door. To take a literal example, I've then seen a director in the middle of tech turn around and say, oh, I think it should be a bigger dog. And what we're talking about is the bark. So
And also, unfortunately, it seems that sound is brought in well after too many other decisions are made.
speaking of real estate
Yeah,
and speakers.
real estate and speakers,
Right.
and
Right.
and I often have to chase the producers down to get contacts for the set designer so I can figure out can I get speakers
always
in
a
the set,
battle.
because usually by the time I meet everybody, everything's being constructed, and it's like, you want to put a hole in what? No, you
That's
can't.
right.
Whereas if we could have gotten together earlier, some compromises could have been made where everyone could have been happy, and I could get speakers in the set. So I end up, and often a sound designer isn't brought in until way later, and then all the monies have been spent on wonderful sets and costumes and lighting.
Then we have to
What's
figure
wrong with that?
Sound is sound.
Well, it's
What's that you say?
How much by the pound? One of the problems is that the better a sound design is, unless it's big and fancy with lots of sound effects, the better it is, the more transparent it is. So I did a production of Meredith Monk's Atlas, and I was actually running the console, and during one of the intermissions, two elderly women were passing the console, and one says to the other, "Oh, this is where all the lighting is done." and I said, "Excuse me for overhearing, but actually this is the sound console." And she said, "Sound? Do you mean amplification?" I said, "Well, yes." And she was very upset. "Well, I didn't hear any amplification." And they left, and she didn't realize that she had paid me the highest compliment I could have gotten. She thought I was just some, person just yanking her chain, but I was very pleased with that. But that's
Well, whenever we talk about design, technology keeps popping up. There's computer-assisted design for scenic design. Beverly, I'd like to come back to you again about you've had a long career. How has the technology changed over the course of your career, and in good ways and bad ways, and how has it affected what's going on?
It's been wonderful. This has been the moment of lighting in the past 50 years. It's leaps and bounds. I initially worked on Broadway shows when they were still DC current in the theater, and they were all manual boards. At the same time, in touring around the country with dance companies, every a college auditorium you walked into had a different version of the current electronic, whatever it is. And as designers, we sort of prided ourselves at being able to speak the language of whatever board we suddenly found ourselves dealing with in order to speed up the process with the operator. But then there was basically, it was an honest competition, and one particular style of console was a clear winner, and I'm talking about the computers that drive the lights, that need a vocabulary, because the best kind of lighting is sometimes done as fast as you can talk, with an operator going as, blah, 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 as fast as they can punch the buttons, because they're dancing it and you're painting it while they're dancing. And if you know, and you're just that little bit behind, and now I need the backlights up there, and now the blue, and now this, and blah, 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 blah. Record it, go to the next. And that speed of console, in the old days, a director would say, can we go back? And the assistant's job was to figure out what dimmers should have been on so that the guys can set it back, and that would take 10 minutes. Now the director says in a rehearsal, can we go back and do that again? You, boom, you're back. So we'd gotten very used to a real stream of consciousness about lighting, and that's wonderful. Not so fast. Just as we got all of that nicely done, the moving lights came in, thank you rock and roll, who had enough money to develop these. And with moving lights now, instead of it just being on and off, and you've stuck a color in it physically, so that's it, and you've aimed it, and that's it. Now it's just on and off. Now every piece of equipment has 10 or 12 attributes that you can suggest. It could be a little over there, could be a little over there, a little bigger, a little smaller, dimmer, brighter, this color, oh, a little more green. I mean, and therefore the time in, and this can only be done live. So the time in the theater is sometimes just ticking away, and you feel, oh, I'm almost got it, and there are 50 people standing there at high salary like this, waiting for you, because everyone's urgent to solve things. And this technology is extraordinary and beautiful, but man, the time it takes. So, I mean, some of the most successful, like Noise Funk, that Jules Fisher and Peggy Eisenhower did, which was really the big move of the moving lights into the Broadway context. First of all, there are two lighting designers. Jules would do all morning physical work and the afternoon rehearsal. Peggy would come in at 4 or 5 o'clock. They would take the evening rehearsal together, and then Peggy and the programmer would be up all night. They would be programming all night, and they did this for 3 weeks, 3 or 4 weeks. So the idea of working all night, we got rid of that a long time ago with community theater. We don't do that anymore. And now it just, the hours and the economic implication of those hours is huge.
And the design aesthetic is also a challenge. At the Williamstown Theater Festival, I also teach an internship with usually anywhere from 10 to 20 young lighting designers. And what I find to be their biggest challenge coming out of these schools is that many of these schools have all of this equipment, have the moving lights, have so much. And the challenge is getting them to turn things off instead of turning things on. I mean, it was when, years ago, before all of this technology, it was just trying to get the money to put the light where you needed it, to get as many lights as you could for the specific moments. Now there are so many lights because they need to be hung very early on. The temptation is to, if there's an issue, just turn it on and fill it in, and then you start canceling out your picture. There's so many lights on that's just completely wiping out your picture. And with young designers, that's what I find most of the time. You're telling them, no, take things out, clear out your vision.
There's inherently nothing interesting about technology. Right. I mean, the technology is there to serve storytelling. And, one of the things we find in every walk of design, in architecture, and thinking about, for instance, in Hairspray, one of the things Jack wanted was the specific sort of eccentricity of John Waters' point of view. So we went back and looked at this kind of almost Baroque American sensibility where he took the ordinary and celebrated it and kind of excess, together with the demand that the show move seamlessly and have 18 different locations. And the technology, for instance, the light bright wall, which came out of playing with a little light bright set, couldn't have been, the notion was to create a kind of low-tech, high-tech thing that didn't have high enough resolution to sort of signal technology, but had the same kind of, early 1960s, we were in love with the space program, we were in love with new material, so that's sort of magic without losing the innocence. And that's where the challenge is. And then we worked with Ken Posner and had 16 million different color options. And actually made models. We made little models with light brights of the pegs in it to try and take it out of the technological realm into the physical. And I got to say, the thing that amazes me most about working in the theater is the amazing passion and the amazing craftsmanship at every single level, down to the last stagehand. And it's just
so good.
The amount of craft and the amount of care about craft. There was recently an article in the Times about the Milan Furniture Show talking about technology and craftsmanship. And theater seems like one of the most, I mean, I just feel so blessed to collaborate with people who are so passionate about what they do and have such amazing skills, and then come together to tell the same story. And technology is a filter to do that, but if it becomes the goal, then it's sort of distancing. You're there saying, wow, well, that's an interesting, you know, you don't want to say that was an interesting move. You want to say that move, you know, what was the feeling?
It's a handmade art form. Still, it's one of the few
It's
left.
the last, yeah, it's the last refuge of the handmade. I mean, where else is an armorer going to get any work these days? I just want to say a big plug for the stagehands. Our guys, and I've worked around the world, our guys are the best in the world. And they are such professionals at dealing and constantly themselves upgrading their knowledge of these technical matters. On shows with moving lights, they are doing brain surgery every night, fixing those lights and keeping them moving, keeping them working. It's just, they're terrific.
I feel like you're in such great hands.
Yeah.
We were in previews for 2 weeks in Seattle, and great stage manager, great crew. I went back to New York, and they said, you know, there seemed to be no glitches. It seems to just be going well. So I went back out opening night. 2 minutes into the show, the entire show ground to a halt. Nothing moved, including my back. There was and at that moment, I realized there is human error. You know, the fact of the matter is it's live theater. It's part of the thrill as it's being reproduced each night in front of you.
Yes.
It's not a mechanized process.
Right. That's right. That's right.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, David.
I was just going to say that a lighting designer friend of mine and I have a mock argument that we like to continue. And one time he was saying to me, now, Dave, when is sound design going to become as sophisticated with computers as lighting design has been for, these past 10 or 15 years? And my response to him was, well, what do you think the status of lighting design, computerized lighting design in theater would be if performers reflected light differently each night depending upon how they were feeling? And he went,
Yeah. Well, now, another sort of nut and bolt question that comes up from time to time, because we're thinking about, you know, working in the theater. How do we get to work in the theater? You know, what happens when we're working in the theater? And one of the questions that arises for me with designers is, you know, actors can audition for roles. Directors presumably can show their reviews or get people to come in and see their work and that sort of thing. But I actually heard Eugene Lee, who is a very talented, very experienced scenic designer, say a couple of years ago that he met with the producers of Ragtime, and then after he met with them, they asked him for some designs. They asked to see some drawings. Now, this is Eugene Lee, who probably has hundreds of productions that he's designed.
That's what the architecture world is like.
How do you do that? Do you have to design?
Well,
do you have to audition?
No, I think
David?
I think everything's an audition to some extent, but you know, I think the way to get the conversation is to talk about the project. To do sketches, I think before you're working on the project is a little bit like name that tune. I mean, if you could design it without really meeting with the director and talking to everyone, then it really wouldn't be much of a challenge if it was just a matter of kind of whipping off an image. But I think, you know, our experience has been that that you sit with the director and you sit with the producers and you talk about it, and ultimately it's a leap of faith. It's a belief that there's a relationship and that there's an understanding of the material and that there's a willingness to work together. So it doesn't seem like auditioning is the right way to sort of think about it. It's more like building a relationship.
When you get back, when you go to that first meeting, you've got the production. What's the pecking order? Who has the first say about what's being done?
Is there a hierarchy in the room when you have
Absolutely.
those first design meetings?
Absolutely.
Those first production meetings? How does that work?
How does it work?
Adrianne? This is when you're not being the producer. This is when you're being the designer.
Yes. Well, I don't know that there is a pecking order. I mean, the people I like to work with the most are collaborators directors who hire their collaborators, and I guess that's the pecking order, is who hires who have asked certain people to work with them because they trust them, and then they pretty much leave them alone. I mean, they talk about what they think about the piece and, you know, how it connects to world politics or you know, what the story is and why it's important to do it at this point. And then they kind of leave you alone. And then they also know how to put everybody's work together at the end. That's what a really good collaborative director knows how to do. It's the way I enjoy it. I mean, I don't like working with directors who say, this is my vision, and you're here to see my vision through. That doesn't interest me much.
Maybe there's a shift. Maybe there's a shift that's coming with the new generation of directors. You know, maybe the hierarchies are breaking down to some extent. Suzy, what's your experience been with that sort of thing?
Well, you always work off your director, of course, but I mean, I found as far as the pecking order goes, of course, the set designer. You know, we work off of what are they going for? You know, what's their look? And then, you know, I mean, our work is not, what we do, costume design is not technology driven. Or, you know, I mean, everyone was talking about the different computers and things like that, but I guarantee you, we make costumes the same way my grandmother made costumes. And, you know, so, you know, I would say as far as, you know, as the pecking order on these things, I mean, you hope that there doesn't feel like a pecking order. You know, I mean, the wonderful thing is when you feel like you're all together working on something. I mean, that's really, I mean, that's the goal. You know, but when it comes down to it, there definitely is a pecking order. And we've all worked on shows, I mean, I hope not too many, where we have been in those circumstances where maybe we don't all get along. Or maybe our vision maybe doesn't meld, which is a learning experience in itself. I mean, I found in some of those experiences where I don't get along with the set designer. Or, you know, things shift, you know, a bit during, there you find out there's a pecking order pretty quick.
I think that when you're in tech, it's more important that there's someone who is in charge. I think when you're in collaborative meetings at the beginning, there's more equality.
Yeah, I learned actually working with Jules Fisher as an assistant to him, and he said this right at the beginning. He said, we do not comment about anybody else's department. Because if we do, they have a right to comment about ours. So in a way, it's if one is talking, one talks to the director and let them solve, is it because the shoes are red, or is it because the color I'm putting on them is red, or is it because it's against a gray background? And, you know, the reasons for any particular visual jarring, we'd all have 6 different ideas. And I think in terms of hierarchy, I certainly don't ever allow myself to even think about, why is that wall that color? That's not my business. That's already been decided. My work is to include that red wall and its color in the whole work of the thing. So in that sense, it is a hierarchy. Those decisions were made at a certain level, and then our job is to...
Unless Beverly, you know, the set designer sitting next to you and says, Beverly, is that color of the wall getting in your way? I mean, should we tone it down?
Yeah,
or
correct.
What do you think?
Well, in that sense, that's the right initiation of the question, because then the two of us can say, well, no, I sort of like it, but maybe it isn't working for you, and we can figure out what color would be better on it.
There's also those wonderful times where someone else, for instance, William Ivey Long on Hairspray, took the neck away for color idea. And, you know, we had the candies, and he came back, and I did not realize there were so many potential neck away for combinations. I mean, it's just phenomenal when the collaboration becomes bouncing the ping pong ball back and forth, and you're actually exchanging ideas, and the idea gets richer and better based on everyone's take on it.
That's the most fun.
That's the most fun, when you can have that kind of collaboration. I mean, the way theater is now, it's difficult sometimes, because it's true, like sometimes you only meet in text.
Right.
And then you're looking at the set that has somehow changed color, but, oh, they didn't get that messenger piece of the wall to you. Uh-oh.
Right.
Sorry.
Right. Well, one of the things that often costume designers, I don't see any color choices. They're supposed to get them to you, but you never do. Partly because it's the reality of their lives. They've got to shop for something. So they have a rough idea, but there's no way to actually send samples. But once I had the experience creating a show, it was a musical, the music was fairly complete. Sitting at my drafting board, actually I started with color. Often I don't, but in that case I sat there and I pulled out all this and that and this and that and that, listening to the music, and I got a big fat envelope from the costume designer, and I opened it up, and all the same colors fell out. I thought, oh, okay.
Well, who gets hired? Who's the first person to get hired? Have you ever been hired as a team? Have you been part of a team that got hired? Or
The set designer gets hired first, and I'm often asked, you know, who I think would be a great this or that or the other thing. So I think in terms of pecking order, it's the director, set designer.
Right.
And then after the set designer,
I think costumes and lighting are kind of equal.
If you look at your playbill, actually, it's in a very specific order.
Sound way down.
And Rui says there's a reason for that.
It's in all of our contracts. The truth be
Now,
told.
when sound gets hired by the general manager, Unless the director knows you particularly?
The musical director?
Yes, on all counts. Usually it's the director. Unless it's a situation where the show there's been several times where the show has actually gotten into tech before anyone realized they needed sound design. And those are the calls I hate the most, because now I have to come in and I have to make it work. Now really all the money has been spent. If I need to use wireless microphones, they say, well, those are too expensive, but it doesn't pay to use bargain wireless microphones, because they are guaranteed to work in rehearsal and not during performance. But no,
so you don't get to charge them extra for coming in at the last minute, then? They've already spent all the money.
You can try, but no. It's often I feel I'm brought in too late, and it's more of an afterthought once they realize how things are working. Sometimes it just takes the realization of how they want to use the set to realize, well, if we're going to have this quiet conversation happen way upstage in that room, well, we're going to have microphones. And then if we've waited as late as tech, now there's not time to go and install things, and I have people running around in the catwalks during rehearsals making people mad. But
we're also trying to, as we think about working in the theater and how to get work in the theater, I wonder how you think students today, young designers today, should approach their craft. I mean, it's something that may seem sort of a no-brainer to you, all of you who are very accomplished in your field, but it's something that the people sitting with us today and the people who will be watching this later want to know. How does one get work, and how does one keep getting work? We talked about that a little bit, but should you go to a training program? Rui, I know you teach. You're saying you mentor.
What I do is I usually pick a book before, speaking specifically about the Williamstown internship. What I do is I'll choose a book for them to read before the summer, and my favorite book to give them is Kitchen Confidential by Anthony Bourdain, which has absolutely nothing to do with lighting. Has everything to do with passion and dedication and having something to talk about at those initial design meetings, because it is all about verbal skills, as Adrianne was saying. It's all about being able to communicate, particularly with lighting, because you can't show them sketches, you can't show them photos really, because it doesn't really reflect what the lighting is. It's all about your relationship with the director. It's the director, it's the director, and sort of driving that home and keeping true to your image and your ideas, but ultimately servicing the needs of the play and the director, and speaking of that collaboration versus hierarchy, you do need a little bit of hierarchy. You do need an arbiter at some point, because we've all done those productions where everyone is in love with everything that you do, and you think, this can't possibly be true. And certainly you walk away and it's not necessarily your best work. You need an editor. Explaining all of that.
Do you have agents to get jobs for you?
Agents don't
Are
get
they
jobs.
Agents don't get jobs for us.
They negotiate the contracts.
Well, how do you get the job?
Well, I think there's a couple of levels. If you want to become a designer in the theater, certainly there are great design programs to apply to. But a more philosophical thing I want to say is that the great thing about what we do is that we can use everything in the world. We need to look at paintings, we need to go to movies, we need to see a lot of theater to make sure we're really that interested. There's music. I mean, you just need to be very well informed on many, many subjects. So you have to be an interesting person to start with. I also think you have to be an artist of some kind, whether that means a poet or a writer or someone who knows how to draw. There needs to be an artistic vision, a strong artistic vision to begin with. And then, I think then the rest, you have to love it, and you have to be really interested in the world, and you have to be really interested in how the world looks. And you have to be very interested in your own view of the world, and know that the way you see things is very important, that your own individual way of seeing things is something to express.
I was recently talking to a bunch of architecture students, giving a 2-hour talk on architecture, and all they cared about was the last 5 minutes about Hairspray. I mean, the sort of love of theater. And what occurred to me is...
Tell us what you mean by the last...
The last 5 minutes of the talk.
Okay.
The talk was on a bunch of projects, but at the end I talked about theater, which to a group of architecture students I assume would be interesting but not crucial. And what was fascinating to me is how much they were interested in the fact that that was my personal passion, and that it was about crossing boundaries. It was kind of going from one profession to another profession. And it was amazing to see these students starting to imagine that, you know, that those boundaries are sort of arbitrary. And if you have a passion for it, and I think it's interesting for theater to be this vital art form that attracts new people, and that people, because it is a fantastic thing to work in. I was mentioning I went to an architecture conference in Venice, which was with, you know, all of the sort of major architects in the world, and I loved it when one of them leaned over to me and said, "Can you get house seats to Hairspray?" And it's sort of, you know, there is a kind of magic, and it's a wonderful thing to do.
Beverly, I know you've been a mentor and a teacher. How do you think that students should be approaching, particularly lighting design students? I mean, they have to get a little box and put some lights in it?
You can't do that. Doesn't work. I'm also working with the American College Theater Festival a little bit, so I'm seeing the results of winners or so forth. And one of the things that I'm sort of railing against is an idea in academic theater that you can put a light plot up on the wall and the designer can stand beside it. The way a designer, scenic design, can stand beside a model, yeah, fine. But you can't see just where the lights are put in the space has nothing to do with how you mix them and how you've made them. And then they're encouraged to create these portfolios.
It's a problem with the models, too, sometimes.
True. But then they give you these photographs that, thank you, Rui, that have nothing to do with anything because the physical fact of light affecting the chemistry of film does not reflect what you actually see up there. It's an approximation. So, and it's only moment by moment, and lighting moves. So, all the things Adrianne said, yes, you have to look how light behaves. Try and figure out why is it doing that. What is it about that? If I was, this one game that we all play teaching is to do some very specific painters and say, okay, let's set up this scene, let's get a girl to sit in a chair and now make the light look like the painter. Lighting designers have to do it and do it and do it and do it. Otherwise, the image I use is talking about lighting is like talking about northern Tibetan cooking, right? I mean, unless you and I can bite a taste, we have no idea how a discussion of this flavor or that flavor might change. It's just, words don't go there. You have to do every bit of lighting that you can get your hands on. And then you have to make sure people see it. And my interest is always to focus on the director or the choreographer and to say, what is this work? How do I reveal it? How do I understand it and let the audience in on it? And therefore have the choreographer and director feel my support and my interest in what they're making.
Excellent. Well, that's a good place for us to take a brief pause while Isabel Stevenson will tell us about the excellent works of the American Theater Wing.
Before we get back to the American Theater Wing's work in a theater seminar on design, I would like to remind you that these seminars are only one of the many year-round programs that the Wing undertakes. You are probably familiar with the American Theater Wing's Tony Awards, given for achievement of excellence in the Broadway theater. We also have an important grants program, providing aid to off-Broadway theaters. We have expanded our scholarships to promising students to pursue studies in the theater arts, and we offer a comprehensive guide to careers in the theater to those seriously interested in entering the profession. As a long-established charity dating back from World War I and World War II and our famous stage door canteens, all of our programs are designed to reward and promote excellence in the theater. We just love to introduce young people and their families to theater and the magic it unfolds. We take pride in the work we do, remain grateful to our members and everyone else whose contributions help make possible the dynamic programs of the American Theater Wing. Our work is so important to the theater and the community, and we are proud to be a part of this exciting industry. Now let's return to our panel on design and our moderator, Jeffrey Jenkins Jeffrey. But I would like to, before we do that, make a point that this panel and the panelists on the stage today make the theater possible. Without them, there would be no theater. So now, Jeffrey, you can take it from there.
Thank you, Isabel. Welcome back. Well, thank you. When we last spoke, we were talking about how to get started as a designer, how we get going, what do you do first, what kind of training do you need? And I wanted to start with Suzy Benzinger again and ask Suzy, how did you get your start as a costume designer? You're the resident costume designer in our little collaboration here today.
Well, let's see. I went to college for it.
Where?
Stony Brook on Long Island. And after the second year, my parents received my report card. My mother said, well, we see you're getting all your A's in your theater courses and you're not attending your other classes. And I said, well, next semester, I think I'll be able to. And she said, your father and I had an idea. How about if you take a year off and you work in the theater for a year? Then you'll be able to figure out, is this really what you want to do? Is this, your life? So I went to Studio Arena Theater in Buffalo, which at the time brought in all the shows. They rehearsed them in New York and brought the shows there. Now it's different, but at the time they used to hire the designers in New York and bring the packaged things out, but they were all premieres in Buffalo. And so my first year there, I was the resident assistant. I first assisted Tennessee Williams on one of the first things I ever did there, and then the designers started floating in, and I got to assist Pat Ziprod and Florence Klotz. And, wow. I mean, it was amazing. The last designer who came in was Jane Greenwood. And Jane said to me, well, what are you doing, darling, after this season is over? And I said, I don't know. I guess I'll go back to school. And she said, well, I'm doing this little production in New York if you have any time. And that's all I had to hear. Oh, my God. And my parents were not really thrilled with the idea. But Jane invited me to live at her home with her husband, Ben Edwards, the set designer, the most elegant man on the face of the earth. And I lived with them, and I worked with her. And she said, but you've got to get a range if you want to be a designer. And so I worked out of Brooks Van Horn with her. And every time a new designer would come in, she'd make sure I became their assistant. So I was the luckiest girl on the face of the earth, because I think now I assisted Raoul Pendubois and Miles White and Pat Ziprod. And really, all those designers were my teachers. They were my professors. So I got to learn color from Willa Kim, and I got to learn, line from Miles White. And so I had the most incredible professors on the face of the earth, and that's how I learned, and that's how I started.
Talk about being in the right place at the right time.
I was in the right place, because no other costume shop works like that now, because in those days, designers didn't automatically get assistants. If you were having your clothes made at Brooks Van Horn, then the assistant there was your assistant who was in the costume shop. So I never had to interview for a job. Raoul Pendubois walked in and they said, here she is, like her or not, And so
how does it work now? Do you designers have apprentices? Do you find talented young students? Do people bang on your door and say, I want to run errands? And how does that work? Adrianne?
The students call a lot from universities looking for work. Sometimes they call and say, I'll volunteer, which is really very smart. And then there are just people who are professional assistants who you hire to do some of the more difficult drafting.
Rui, well, you I guess probably pick up some help from the interns
from my pool, yeah, or my mafia, they've also been called. But I had Williamstown has meant a lot to me over the years, and it gave me a lot of my beginnings, and I feel like giving back a lot to the.
Did you study design in school?
I studied at Boston University, and I was I had gone to Williamstown as a master electrician 1 year. This was Nikos Sakharopoulos' last season. And then the following season, and during that year, I was a master electrician, but I also assisted a director slash lighting designer, Peter Hunt, who was a fantastic lighting designer and a great teacher. But I did one show with Peter, and then the following season, Peter was going to head up part of the, he was going to take over for Nikos after Nikos passed away as part of a triumvirate. And he called me, and we had a long discussion about the light plot, and, you know, and at the end I said, well, I'm not really sure if I can come back this summer. You know, I'm graduating, I'm thinking about applying for the New York City Opera internship. Thinking about it, I hadn't even actually applied. And Peter said, no, I really want you to come back. What if I gave you a show? And I'm thinking, a show? To design a show? I thought, great, it would be an honor to design a show in the other stage. And it's a little 97-seat house, and which was where they do the more experimental work. So I think about it for 30 seconds, and I say, sure, absolutely, I'd love to do a show. And sign me up for the summer. I'll be there. I'll be your resident assistant. I show up, and I walk into the down the hallway, and the call boards are up. And I walk past the call board, and under the first main stage is my name as lighting designer. How in the world? And that season, I not only ended up doing that show, I ended up doing three main stage shows that season.
Now, David Meschter, to be a sound designer, must one first have a huge stereo system in when you're a teenager in your bedroom?
Who told you about my
We have our sources.
Yes, I had not a large stereo system, but several tape decks, and I had always been interested in sound. I had initially gone to Lafayette College in Pennsylvania for my freshman year, and make a long story short, I had pneumonia during that time a little bit, so that my semester was messed up, and most of my friends were electrical engineers, and they knew that before they got to the school, so I felt like every semester that passed where I didn't define my future, I was limiting my future. And my parents also suggested that I take some time off. As my father put it, if I'm going to help you pay for school, I'd rather you know what you want to get out of it so we can buy what you want. And in that time, I realized that I wanted to somehow mix music and communications, because I had both those are very strong drives in me. And I started researching schools, and I ended up finding American University in D.C. had a very new audio program. And when I went down there to interview, I met the man who designed the program, and I ended up going there. They had very, very little equipment, but I got an immediate sense from this gentleman that he was going to be a very important person to help me get out of school what I even though I don't know what I need. So I went. They had a new audio technology program there, which was probably only in its third year then. And then walking past his office one day, Romeo Sagnan was the designer of the program, a northern Italian, and he says, David, want to go to Europe? I said, sure, what's up? And he said, here. And he handed me a piece of paper, and it had David Tudor's name and phone number on it. And I was like, I can't call, I know who David Tudor is, I can't call him. But I called, and as it turned out, I happened to reach Mr. Tudor in a 20-minute window when he should not have been home. He should have been in Manhattan. And I explained who I was, and he said they were looking for a new sound person at the Cunningham Company. And so he invited me to the performances to see. I said, well, what does the job entail? Because I knew the name John Cage, but I didn't know the name Merce Cunningham. I think modern dance is a secret art in the United States. You have to seek it out, and when you do, you can fall in love with it. But you don't get exposed to it until you seek it out. So in any case, I went to the performance, and by the end of the day, they were saying things like, well, you have to watch this console, because if this leg is loose, the transformer's loose. And in a week and a half later, I was packing for a domestic and European tour and finding a sublet for my apartment, and I had no one had ever paid me to do any kind of sound before. So that's how I...
You know, that's interesting. There's sort of a through line in what I hear all three of you saying, and one is that, and this is something I think Adrianne touched on earlier, and that is being open to new experiences and taking on new experiences as they come. And in the case of each of the three of you, I heard you say yes. to what was presented to you. Not how much am I going to be paid, how is this going to affect my career, how is this going to build my career, but this is an opportunity. Yes. And I want to ask David Rockwell about how architecture, how being an architect has influenced and has informed your work as a theater designer. You know, when I think back to your Rocky Horror Show designs, which were so amazing and inventive, with the theater seats that flipped inside and out, and the laboratory that, you know, drops from the ceiling. You put the labor back in laboratory. But, you know, how does being an architect influence that?
Well, my interest in theater actually preceded my interest in architecture, in that I was sort of brought up in my mother was a dancer in vaudeville, and my family was very similar in sort of function to the family in Waiting for Guffman. The local community productions, we lived on the Jersey Shore, and putting together theater, for me, I had 4 brothers, and I found that doing theater was a chance to create this magical alternative reality out of nothing. You'd sort of go into this auditorium. I actually recently looked at some of the flats that I helped paint as a kid from The King and I, which I remembered being so glorious. And they were essentially 4x8 canvas with little gold paint on them. You know, the memory was of this magical place that was created. And then we moved to Guadalajara, Mexico when I was 10, and I found my love of theater sort of morphed into a love of public spaces. And the marketplaces and the color in Mexico were so inherently theatrical. And then I went to architecture school because it seemed like there was a lot of cast-in-place concrete happening in Mexico, and intense color, and I was interested in it. But I found I always gravitated back towards theater, and second year I was in New York, and I'd seen Dracula, Edward Gorey's Dracula, lit by Roger Morgan. And I was stunned by it. I just thought it was so beautiful. I went to Roger Morgan's studio and called him up, and I said, I'd like to work for you, and I'll do it for 2 weeks for free, and if it works out, why don't you hire me? And he was just getting ready to do Crucifer of Blood, I believe. So I worked for him for 2 weeks. I fell in love with him. He was the most amazing mentor. And I took a semester off and actually loved theater so much that I decided to transfer to London for a year from Syracuse, which was not a center of great theater at the time, although they had a great theater program. But I really found going to theater was such an important part of engaging me. And over in London, I gravitated towards theater. Finished architecture school, and it was really just fate. I designed a restaurant that became very successful 4 years out of school. I wasn't a great employee. I was a better employer. So I figured, you know, I did this restaurant, it worked well, and I went into business for myself. And it was about 5 or 6 years ago that I was having lunch with Jules Fisher, who's a very close friend, and we spent a lot of time together. And I was sketching, because I go to the theater 2 or 3 times a week and always sketch and design. And he said, you know, David, your level of interest when you talk about theater is so amazing. Why don't you try doing something in the theater? So in a sense, I think my teachers were, I saw, the first show I ever saw was Fiddler on the Roof, which is one of the reasons why I'm interested in doing it now. I saw it standing room only. And I've got to say, the unfolding of Boris Aronson's environment was just mesmerizing. And you didn't need to know anything about Anna Tefka for this to tell that story. So I guess my teachers were the great productions that I saw in the kind of analysis. And so I took a chance. And with Rocky Horror, when I met with Chris Ashley about Rocky Horror, I had never seen the movie. So I rented the movie. Part of living in Mexico for 8 years was pop culture was new to me, so it was a new take. And I rented the movie and watched it, and I said, I have no idea what everyone's carrying on about. This is the most peculiar thing I've ever seen in my life. And then I went to see the show in a movie theater with an audience and realized it's about the interaction. And then Chris Ashley spoke to me about, you know, the real show's about creating yourself in your own image. And for my first theater experience, it seemed like a perfect chance. So
it almost sounds as though your architecture work is influenced by theater more than your theater work is influenced by architecture. Is that?
I think that's probably true. We're working on an airport in Vegas, and we're now going to bring in a choreographer. to deal with.
You are so lucky.
To deal with movement and search. Because, you know, once you deal with getting the baggage there, somehow moving through the space wants to feel wonderful.
Fabulous.
Great idea.
Great idea. Now, we've talked a lot about relationships, about the collaborations with the directors. We haven't said much about producers. We'll let that go for now. But what about the relationships that you have with the performers? Now, Suzy, certainly you have more interaction with the performers.
We were just talking about that, yes.
Oh, yeah?
I wish I had taken my psychology courses. It is probably 90%. I hate to say it. Sometimes it's 90% of the job, depending on the piece. And it's different. I mean, I was saying I've done some films for Woody Allen, and when you're doing those films, you're getting actors, and you're with them for like an hour, and then they're on camera. I mean, you really have very little time with them. And so in those instances, you try to get right to the heart of the matter and try to get through what their image is and get to the character in a very quick manner. In theater, it's of course different because you have much more time. But it really is. That's so much of our job. It is so much of our job to make them feel comfortable, to make them feel like they look good, that they can move in something or dance in something. It really is.
Well, how does that work for the other design elements? How does that work for you, Adrianne? Do you have an interaction with the performers?
With the performers?
How does
Not
that,
as much as costume designers do, which is one of the reasons I'm not a costume designer. I just think I'd be very good at that.
Smart, very smart.
I did flash on when I did Anne Frank. The cast had been in rehearsal room for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and they came onto the set for the first time. We were in Boston, and Linda Lavin, who played I can't remember the name of the character now. The sort of larger than life wife who kind of takes over the place, who has the coat. Just sat down and started to weep, and Austin Pendleton was in it too, and they all just started to hold on to each other and weep, and I thought, okay, well, I got this right. Because it was a character that they had been missing in a rehearsal room. I mean, suddenly they were stuck in the annex.
How about you, David Meschter, in sound design? How does that come into play with the performers? And are you dealing with them in a live sense?
Yeah.
And then you're dealing with them often, I would think, in some kind of recorded sense.
Yes, sometimes too. No, it's the psychology. I would say 90% also in my field, and it still surprises me sometimes. But no, I have to, particularly in a situation where performers are going to wear wireless microphones. It's some people get very nervous about it, and I try to I usually wire people myself so they get a sense that the person who is putting the microphone on them is also, someone really plugged into making things sound good for them. Not that other people couldn't do it, but there are some artists that, oh no, Dave has to come and do it. No, they can't do it. But no, it is important to have a good relationship with the performers, particularly in a sense where if we're also sending sound back to the stage for monitors, making sure that people don't have to ask for more monitor level, but that they're comfortable. So even when I know the monitors are fine, I'll ask, because they need to know that there's a voice out there in the dark that is paying attention to how they're feeling. And if they're more relaxed, they don't need the monitors as much, because when the performers are uptight and still trying to put a piece together and a mistake is made, it's much easier to point at the technology of causing the problem than, personally. So if people are calmed down a bit, it actually flows a little easier. So.
Well, now, Rui and Beverly, you're lighting designers, and you almost have to have the actors there and have to interact with the actors to some extent, the performers to some extent, when you're doing tech and working with that. And I know that there are some designers who don't want to do any tech work without bodies moving in space, which producers sometimes balk at. How does that, what is the challenge there for you?
Well, bodies moving in space and interacting with the actors, that's the difference. There is comfort in the darkness in the back of the house, and I usually do run through the filter of the director in dealing with the actors. But there are moments when you do need to interact, and there are specific moment that I was just thinking of was doing Mandrake Root with Lynn Redgrave. At the end of the first act, she bears herself from the waist up. And it's a very particular moment, and the lighting is very key, and we had many discussions about the angle and exactly how much we see, what we don't see, what the revealing is, and what the emotion is. And so we had many discussions. We did the production at the Long Wharf in New Haven, and it was that last final moment was successful. We did the production then at the San Jose Rep in California, and we got to that moment. It was essentially a remount, so the show was in the computer, and we ran to that moment, and we stopped, and we said, "Are we ready to do it?" And we said, "Yes, we're ready." So we continued. She took her jacket off, and nothing happened. The lights are on. There's no blackout. Nothing happened. And the stage manager was new and thought that she didn't have to call the final blackout. So she finally stood out there, and she waited and waited and waited, and turned around to us and said, "Are you going to turn the lights on?" So yeah, there is interaction.
Where do you get the fabrics for costume today? Where do you get the fabric for costume?
We get the fabrics pretty much in the same places that have been in New York for for so many
Brooks
years.
Brothers and
We go to the fabrics. We go to like B&J. We go to Art Max. We go to the same stores that have existed for. And a lot of these stores, the grandsons are now running them. There's generations of families there. It's changing a little bit, because now there's a lot of Egyptians are now moving in, and Indians moving into the fabric business. It used to be very much a different sort of business then.
do they specialize in fabrics for the theater, or is it?
No, there are very few of those companies left that specialize in, because I don't know what theater fabrics are anymore. I mean, it used to be.
Yeah.
When I first came, it was the sort of fabric that you saw in kids' dance recitals. Lots of fluorescent tones and satins and things like that, But I think we go to the same fabric stores that everyone else does. We always wish we get a discount because we buy a lot. We don't. It costs us more. They see us coming, and it costs us more. But
Well, cost is something that we should talk about for a moment or two, because if you want to do a Broadway musical, $10 million to start with, probably. I'm guessing that Frog and Toad is a lot less than that.
It was a lot less than that, and it's because we did it in a great regional theater first, and
Sure.
moved the entire physical production from Minneapolis.
At Children's
So we
Theater in
got a
Minneapolis.
$3 million set for $200,000, which is really the way to do it at this point.
Wow. That's an amazing figure. Now, how do costs affect the way you do things? Beverly?
I'd like to tie in with something we talked about before, and about the actors too, because increasingly, I don't know, Rui, if you've run into this, there's gotten to be a fantasy out there that there's a way of eliminating the tech. Or, oh, it isn't nice for the actors to stand there, it's such hard work. Can't we just do this on the bare stage? Of course, good actors know how to use that time. They're handling their props. The director's finally leaving them alone because he's worried about the light cues, so they have a chance to work. But there's pressure out there to do what's called pre-text. Pre-text?
Or dry tech.
And
yeah.
dry
Dry
tech.
tech.
Dry tech used to happen after the cues were written, and we could just go through things quickly. But now the pre-tech idea, I've had stage managers say, well, could you put the cues in my book the weekend before the tech? And I say, well, you probably know where Q1 is going to happen, and you probably know where the blackouts are going to happen. So, but in between, I don't know yet. We're going to create it as we go along. Yeah. And one needs to, especially the lighting designers, have to paint in the context. There's pressure, technological pressure, to think it all up in your bedroom, and bring it in on a disc and slip it into the machine. No. And the way you get actors to understand the process is to talk about how beautiful they're going to be if they give you a chance to help to do that for them. And but there's a lot of current pressure to and it's because of time, which always equals money. Is can we do this some way without this process.
And most shows have to tour
Yes.
in order to be economically viable.
Right. And the other thing
we
that-
all know that, like Angels in America, never made its money back until it'd been on tour for
It's
quite a while.
not understood that when you take a show from one theater to another, adjustments have to be made. Producers think you just plug it in and it plays like a video, and every space is
Each theater's
different.
different.
And how much of the cost labor is. And when you know, one of the things you talked about in materials is, one way, I guess, to deal with budget is find materials from different sources. We were pressured on the hair curtain in Hairspray, which is 7 miles of red rubber tubing, to find an inexpensive material that would do that, and we found it. What we didn't expect is a lighting designer was then going to say, well, is it going to melt together when it's up in the, you know, so we had to test that. But by not going to necessarily the first instinct about what the material would be, but trying to do some research on inexpensive materials, you can get the effect without that particular cost.
I think the worst problem with finances in the theater now is that all of us, in order to survive, have to do too many projects. And it's one of the reasons why we never get into a room together. And it would just be so wonderful if you did 3 things a year. I mean, the results would be
Well,
extraordinary.
we could continue this conversation for hours, and I'd like to do that. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for this program. This has been the American Theater Wing's Working in the Theater seminar, coming to you from the Graduate Center of City University at New York. Thank you for joining us.